Yeah, this is what we call the three circles. And so the world that we live in, man, it's broken. We see all kinds of terrible things going on that we just know inherently are wrong. But in the beginning, God created a perfect world, a world without brokenness, a world that was, you know, paradise where people experience perfect love with one another and with their creator. And so we have to ask the question, well, that's what God created, then why do we live in this broken world? And the answer to that specific question is, in the beginning and in everyday sense, we've chosen to rebel against God's plan. God laid things out and man turned the other way. And that brought us into brokenness. Living in brokenness is not a joyful experience. And we know that that's not what we were created for. So we're trying to get out of brokenness. For some people, it's, relationships. If this guy or this girl would love me. For some people, it's money, power, career success. For some people, it's drugs or alcohol. Others, it's religion. They want to be a good person and do good things and think that's going to get them out of their brokenness. But all of those things that we pursue are like bungee cords. We pull hard, but man, they will suck us back in deeper into brokenness. So how do we reconcile this? If God is a loving God and this is what he created, well, in his love, he came down to this earth in the person of Jesus. And Jesus never rebelled against the Father's plan. Another word for rebellion is just sin. He never sinned, but he ultimately died a sinner's death on a cross. And he was taking the penalty for my rebellion, taking the penalty of my sin and paying my sin debt on the cross. He was buried, and 3 days later, he rose from the grave, not only taking my sin, but defeating death itself. And in doing that, Jesus miraculously opened a door, opened access back into God's perfect design, back to the Father. Jesus calls himself the door, and he says that we can exit out of our brokenness through him if we would turn. In the beginning, we turned away from God, and we're just turning our minds back to God and his will and plan for our life. And we trust that Jesus is sufficient to take the penalty of my sin and that he's defeated death in his life, his death, and his resurrection. And then we make Jesus the king of our life. Jesus calls the shots. And whenever we do that, when Jesus is our king, the Father welcomes us back into his kingdom, not as a slave or a servant, but as a child. And we come back into God's kingdom and we experience peace and joy that passes all understanding. And so we see there's two types of people in the world. There's people who are living in brokenness, trying their own way to get out. And there's people who's turned from their way and back to God's way, trusted in Jesus's act for us and made them king of their life and been brought back into the kingdom. So where do you find yourself today? In brokenness or as a child of the one true king?